Good morning everyone, Joy Horner here, and we just had World Mental Health Day at the weekend. It was on Saturday, so today's subject is going to be about perinatal mental health, and it's a subject dear to my heart because I suffered dreadful postnatal depression after the birth of my first baby, and I think because of that it's helped me specialise and help people who've had previous trauma or are struggling in their pregnancies. It's one of the things I do really well. So, why do we need to talk about this? Because about 1 in 3 people describe their birth as traumatic. And that's a dreadful, dreadful statistic. People thinking their birth was traumatic. People experiencing their birth as traumatic, not just thinking it, they experience it as traumatic. And the effect that this can have on their family, really, it puts a strain on everyone and it impacts their ability to parent. It can be really dreadful. 1 in 3 people suffer birth trauma. And 1 in 10 people now that have given birth go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder in relation to a birth that they've had. 1 in 10, that's incredibly high, isn't it? Dreadful, dreadful statistics. I've put a link to Mind, the mental health charity. They've got brilliant sections on mental health and well-being during pregnancy and postnatally. So it's worth checking that out as a resource. So how does it happen? Why is this happening? I've got loads and loads of theories, but the basic thing, when we actually get down to the essence of it, it's because people are unsupported during childbirth. And I'm guessing that that's probably worse at the moment with the COVID situation, because birth partners aren't normally allowed in for the whole of the care pathway in many areas, which means, excuse me, that when people present at the hospital or the birth centre, if they're going to give birth there, terribly sorry, got a frog, that their partner usually isn't admitted until they're in active labour, and many trusts ask to do a vaginal examination to confirm someone's in active labour, which is problematic if you can't accept vaginal examinations, and there are many, many reasons for that. You know, lots of people, I can't remember, it's between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 adults has suffered abuse in their past, in their childhood, and many, many people can have suffered sexual abuse and cannot bear the thought of internal examinations. So it's entirely unfair to not let a partner in until someone's had a vaginal examination, because that might be when they need their partner the most, you know, to be their advocate and to notice if they've zoned out and disassociated. And really, really important stuff. So it happens with people being unsupported. It also happens with people being uninformed about the birth process and interventions and procedures that are commonly offered. So unfortunately, years and years ago, when I became an independent midwife and one of my clients had to go to theatre for a reason, and of course they wouldn't let me in as her support person, they let her husband in, which was great, and I was left alone in the room waiting for her to return, and the midwifery coordinator came in to see me, and I was asking how her night was and how it was all going, and it was a really busy night, and she said, "Do you know what, Joy, it's all to do with numbers and throughput. I've got to get women through the labour ward as quickly as possible because there are more women coming in. I've got to get them on the postnatal ward as quickly as possible." And that shocked me to the core, although I knew it was the truth. That's probably why it shocked me to hear it spoken out loud, that in a big maternity system, they have to think of numbers and throughput. She said, that's all it is, Joy, numbers and throughput. That's my job, numbers and throughput. Where are the people in that? Awful, awful. And of course, you're much more likely to have interventions and standardised care if you go to a standardised institution to give birth. And some of us don't have a choice in that. I had both my babies in hospital. I didn't choose to have my babies in hospital, but situations arose and I needed to have my babies in hospital. But there have been many, many studies which show you're much less likely to have interventions if you have a home birth, or at least a birth centre birth. If you're low risk, even if you're high risk, actually, the outcomes are pretty good. But yeah, do consider where you give birth, because this can lessen your chances of having a traumatic experience, a traumatic birth. Okay, so when does it happen? Yeah, perinatal mental health can be affected antenatally and postnatally. So it doesn't always matter if you've had mental health problems before, although it's a little bit more likely if you've had mental health problems when you're not pregnant that you may get them when you are pregnant or after birth. But even if you've never had mental health problems, and I think it's 1 in 10 of us in society does have, bad mental health problems at some point in our lives. Excuse me. But even if you've not had anything in your past, if you become ill, or there's a problem with you or your baby during the pregnancy, or you lose a loved one dies, you can find yourself suffering antenatal depression or anxiety. And it's not always spoken about. In my courses, I concentrate a lot on basically, shoring up people's mental health, making sure they've got enough support, and everyone can get support. It doesn't matter if you've got a partner with you or not, if you're near your relatives or not. Even in the middle of nowhere, on your own, you can get support. You can get online support. And if you were in the middle of nowhere without a partner and no access to anything, my courses do prepare you for that. Because you have to be self-sufficient. You have to make sure you have everything you need for your health and well-being. Okay, away from my courses. That was just a little side thing. So antenatally, you can prepare your body, your mind, and you can prepare practically to preserve your mental health. And what I mean is you can get everything in place, you can write lists, you can make sure you've written down lots of resources for after the birth, you've made sure that you've got birth partners with you who are informed and strong and will stand by you. You've chosen your place of birth wisely. You've looked into the normal birth process and what that involves. You've also looked into interventions and routine care that might be offered to you. So nothing will be a surprise when you go into birth. If you also write a birth plan, again, I've got a whole course on this. Write a birth plan, because you're not planning how your birth will be, because none of us can do that. It's down to nature. We can't plan how our birth's going to be, but we are planning our preferences for birth, the things that we would like to do, the things that we would like to avoid, the care we would like to have, and anything we wouldn't like to have happen to us during our birth. Now, that's okay, writing a single birth plan and saying, I hope to avoid cesarean and forceps or whatever it is you don't want. But you've also got to plan for those scenarios. So I suggest writing 4 birth plans at least. So you have plan A, this is my ideal birth, this is how I'd like it to be, and that's what you give your care provider at the start of your labour when they come to assess you at home or when you enter the establishment. Yeah, so that's plan A. Plan B is if things don't go to plan, if you have a transfer to hospital during your labour and you were planning a home birth, or you were planning a hospital birth and without any pain relief, and now you need an epidural or a forceps birth or a Von-Teuse, that's plan B. Plan C you need to write in case you have a caesarean birth, because there are lots of choices around that you need to look at. And plan D is the golden hour and the period after birth. What you would like done to you and your baby after birth. How you would like your golden hour or two, because it's not just 1 hour that this is limited to, how you would like that time to be. And again, think about the ideal, what you would like, what you wouldn't like. And ask your care provider what things need to be done immediately after birth and what can wait until after the golden hour. Because in my experience as a midwife, there's very little we need to do in that golden hour to you or your baby. Right, so that's writing birth plans. So that's another way to prepare antenatally. I'm just about to produce a workbook with all this in it, actually, how you can prepare for birth. But there we go, more on that later. Not going to give any more spoilers. So why does it happen? As we said, being uninformed and unsupported can predispose you to having birth trauma, basically. But it's not actually the type of birth that you have that can cause birth trauma. So I've had clients, and I know other midwives have had clients who've had unexpected outcomes. So you weren't planning that emergency caesarean, you certainly weren't planning to have an epidural or whatever happened, unexpected outcomes. And yet those people's mental health after birth aren't as badly affected as the people who have normal births, and sometimes without any intervention whatsoever, but they weren't listened to and they weren't believed in labour. So that's a big number of people. There's another group of people to whom things were done in labour and they suffer birth trauma because of it. And that's because things weren't adequately explained to them as to the reason why it was necessary, and that they, in an emergency, perhaps they couldn't opt out of it. You know, baby's heart rate's got really, really low, and the doctor has suggested that getting the baby out really quick would be a really good idea. And sometimes with everything happening, you haven't got enough time to think about that and process that. And even though you wouldn't say no, you know, to your baby being helped out, there isn't enough time to process what's going on when things are done to you in a hurry. There's also people who normally in that intervention group, when things are being done and in a hurry, who fear for their lives and fear for their babies' lives. And we know this is more likely to lead to postnatal depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, if everyone's rushing about and you're being rushed to theatre, you know, and you think, oh my goodness, I might die or my baby might die, you know, then you might suffer mental ill health after birth. And it's really, really important that we help people in this time, because if there has been a traumatic birth, actually, after any birth, I think people ought to be given the opportunity to talk through their birth. And I don't know if it was something I was taught as a student midwife back in the 80s or something that I just did. I guess we must have been encouraged to do it. But when we were working on labour ward, we were encouraged to follow those people up postnatally. So to go up to the postnatal ward and to speak to those people and ask how the birth was for them. And it was like a very early intervention in preventing mental ill health. Because people had time to talk about what happened and why. And when people make a complaint to the hospital or when they ask for their notes after birth, they normally just want to know what happened and why. And the sad thing is, when we get the notes, they don't always reflect what happened and why. You know, over the past 15 years as an independent midwife, I've been asked to look through many, many people's notes, and I have to warn them beforehand, it will not represent how you feel, and it will not represent your experience of birth. You know, quite often what is written is that the person's coping very well. Coping well, breathing through contractions, contracting 2 in 10, contracting 3 in 10, fetal heart. Yeah, it doesn't actually say what you said in that moment, you know, how you felt, you know, were you able to express it, or had you gone within because you were terrified in that moment? Yeah, it's not an accurate record of your experience at all. It's a record of the observations that were done and the procedures that were done to you, usually. But that can be helpful, you know, just to get a timeline, to get perspective on when things were done and who did them. But I think it's important to talk things through after someone's had a birth, even if it was a straightforward birth. And back in the 80s, we offered a lot of pethidine. I don't know if we offered it, but it was the drug of choice, really. We had Entonox, people used Entonox, and then the next drug of choice was pethidine. So lots of women and birthing people have pethidine in their labours. And I remember looking after one person, and I don't know if it was their first or subsequent. I guess it was a subsequent baby, because baby happened really quite quickly after the pethidine was given. So we'd offered an internal, the person had accepted it. They weren't in advanced labour, so we gave the pethidine, and lo and behold, you know, everything relaxes and the baby was coming real quick. So when I spoke to this person postnatally on the postnatal ward, I said, how was the birth? And they said, oh, great, yeah, you know, I'm really chuffed. I got my little girl or boy or whatever. Don't remember. It was really good, and thank you, and all the rest of it that normally comes after a birth. But, and this was the killer for me, but the moment you put the baby on my tummy, I thought it was a wash bag. I thought you were going to give me a wash. Now, that person hadn't had a bad experience. You know, they described it as very positive, but it really upset me that they sort of missed the moment of their baby's birth. And that's kind of irrelevant, because that's just my perception of it. Their perception was that it was a really positive birth, so I congratulated them and told them how well they'd done and what a surprise it was that the baby had happened so quickly. Yeah, because that's important too, not to put our own stuff on the people, however we perceive the birth. So as I said, it's not the type of birth you have, it's how people made you feel. So that woman obviously felt listened to and respected and looked after, which was really important. So there was no negatives for that woman, which is great. The opposite can be true. If you feel people are not listening to you at all, if you feel that you're not being believed. I've had clients that have suffered trauma in previous births, and the midwife hasn't believed the baby's coming. The woman has said, my baby's coming, I can feel it coming. Oh, don't be silly, we've just done an internal and you're 4 centimetres. Don't be silly. And I had one poor person who contacted me who'd had on paper a perfectly normal birth, but wasn't believed that she was in labour at all. So first time mum, and had driven a long way to the hospital and had a vaginal examination, which was showed she was 1 centimetre dilated. So hospitals doing what they normally do, you're probably best going home because it can take hours, yeah, and you're not in established labour. And basically, we don't want people clogging up a space when people in active labour come in, because we might not have enough beds. On that night, we weren't busy, so there were enough beds. So she was allowed to stay even though she wasn't in established labour. And she was allocated a very new student midwife to watch over her. And the new student midwife obviously didn't pick up the signs of rapidly advancing labour. And the woman said she was panic struck because she thought that, she was having all these really intense sensations and felt absolutely dreadful, because if that was early labour, how was she going to cope with the real thing? And it set off a real panic reaction in her during the labour, and no one could reassure her that this was normal, because no one checked on her throughout the night. They just left her be because she was in early labour. Perhaps someone might have listened to the fetal heart or something, but no one believed that her labour was as advanced as it was until her baby's head started to crown and the student midwife had a look. And then all hell broke loose because everyone ran into that birth room, and it was panic stations. So although it was a normal birth, in a birth centre without any interventions, that woman was incredibly traumatised by that. So, yeah. What can I say? We've got to believe women, and if no one's believing you, ask to speak to someone else. Someone's got to believe you. This is dreadful. People are being traumatised by this. So I think that's about it for today. I've spoken about what we can do antenatally to prevent these things, and mostly it's about getting support in. And you can do that via Zoom. There are lots of support groups. There are lots of good websites. Mind is my favourite at the moment. There's also PANDAS, which is the postnatal and antenatal depression support. But there's lots and lots of help out there. So just reach out for that help. And as I said, know that my courses are full of really good tips on how to protect your mental health and how to prepare mentally as well as physically for your birth. That's about it. So I'm going to wind up there. I've spoken for a long time as usual. I expected to do a short one. So any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them later. Okay, bye.